Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we nearly all have the handouts there. You can read them afterwards and it will be explanatory notes. I want to, first of all, thank you all for your patience. Obviously, Nollaig got delayed between weather, roadworks and everything else. I'll let him explain it, but thank you for persevering with us to be able to stay for the talk. I'm sure it'll be well worth it. So, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Nollaig Ó Muraíle and the Annals of Masters.
Now, the topic, Fergal and the Annals of the Four Masters, which was suggested to me some good while ago. The Moygara there might have had a hand at giving me the substantive title. And when I set to work on it, I thought there was plenty to write and talk about on that. And then I realised everything we know about Fergal could probably fit on a single sheet of paper. So that's the bad news. But the other thing, on the other hand, the Annals of Four Masters will go on until this time tomorrow. So I won't do that. So I'll try and go for some kind of an in-between happy medium. Now, the principal topic of the talk is a notable man who lived in this area about 4 centuries ago. His name was Fergal Moygara, or in anglicised form, Fergal, chief of the ruling family of that name, that was based in this part of South Sligo and adjacent parts of Mayo and Roscommon for well over a millennium before that, probably much longer. 2 families named Moygara and O'Hara, that's Moygara and O'Hara, lived in close proximity to each other, and according to surviving genealogies from the medieval period, they were closely related, even though in the Irish forms the 2 names are quite unconnected, just that there's a slight similar sound. The O'Garas occupied the territory of Lyne, whose name survives in the barony name of Lyne in County Sligo. They were also associated with the territory of Slieve in northeast Mayo. The precise area of Slieve is debated, but kind of the north of the barony of Costello, largely in East Mayo. Eventually they were based in what was termed the half barony of Coolavin, including the place where we're standing here now, Gurchian. Another significant feature in Coolavin, of course, is Lough Gara, one of the 2 largest lakes in County Sligo, the other being Lough Arrow. Lough Gara, representing Lough Ira, the Lake of Moygara, is a relatively late name form. I think it first appears in the 15th century, replacing the name used in medieval times, Lough Chechid. The meaning of the second element, Chechid, is a bit uncertain. Perhaps it somehow linked with the word, with the verb chech, to flee, but we won't go into that now. For an excellent outline of the history of Moygara, the O'Garas, I refer you to an article entitled The O'Gara Dynasty Through Time and Place by a member of the family, here present, Máire O'Gara O'Riordan, together with her friend the late Maureen Carroll, and that's in the magnificent volume, which I see here on the table, Moygara Castle, County Sligo, edited by Kieran O'Connor, and published last year by Four Courts Press. There's also a fine chapter in it by an old friend of mine, Dr. Anne Connan of University College Cork. And another book that sheds useful light on aspects of Sligo history in the period in question is Power, Politics and Land, Early Modern Sligo, 1568 to 1688, by a former colleague of mine in Queen's University, Belfast, Mary O'Dowd. I have it here. Many of you have probably seen it or even read it. Now, while Fergal was clearly a significant figure in early 17th century Sligo, some parts of his story remain frustratingly vague and obscure. Some recent research has clarified certain aspects of the story, which much still remains unclear. Among details of Fergal's life on which light has been shed is the year of his birth. It appears that he was born in 1596 to Taig O'Gara, who died 2 years later when the infant was only, around about 2 years old. I've not yet seen any details of the identity of Fergal's mother, but maybe somebody could help me on than that. After the death of Tig, his young son was looked after by his paternal grandfather, Ellen, sometimes written Iriel O'Gara. And when the grandfather died in 1614, Fergal was made a ward of court, a system described by Moygara as one under which, quote, young inheritors not yet of age of important estates were put under the guardianship of persons whom the English administration considered to be reliable. The person appointed as Fergal's guardian was Sir Theobald Dillon, who was described as among the most important people in Connacht at the time. Dillon was one of a number of so-called palesmen who had obtained land in County Sligo, members of the Old English community, mainly from the area on or near the east coast known as the Pale, who in the late 16th century acquired property by fair means or foul in and around North Connacht. The relationship of Fergal O'Gara to Theobald Dillon is recorded thus in the Calendar of Patent Rolls of the Chancery of Ireland of James I. Quote, grant to Sir Theobald Dillon Knight of the Wardship of Farrell O'Gara, grandson and next heir of Iriel O'Gara, late of Moygara in Sligo County, gentleman, deceased, for a fine and an annual rent for his maintenance and education in the English religion and habits and in Trinity College, Dublin, from the 12th to the 18th year of his age. Now, in April 1614, sometime after Ella's death, Fergal was reported to be 18 years of age and unmarried, and an account written a year and a half later, however, reports that he was in 19 and a half years of age and married. We learned from other sources that his bride was Elizabeth Taff, daughter of Sir William Taff. This Taff was based in Ballymote Castle and served as an agent of the President of Connacht. In other words, he was a representative in Ireland of the English Crown here in Connacht. Professor Mary O'Dowd is of the opinion that Elizabeth, also referred to as Isabel, may have been the granddaughter, not the daughter, of Sir William, and indeed she refers to her as the daughter of Sir John Taff, Viscount Corran. Now, there would seem to be a problem with some of these details. If, as the ward of court, Fergal was required to attend Trinity College, Dublin, when aged between 12 and 18, that would mean he was there between the years 1608 and 1614. But that would appear to be at odds with what a book relating to the college and published 1924 has to tell us. It's entitled the Alumni Dublinensis, Register of the Students, Graduates, Professors and Provosts of Trinity College, and it contains the following entry. Number 633, O'Gara Farrell, grandson of Iriel Moygara, County Sligo, Ward, January the 12th, 1615, 16. This indicates that Fergal O'Gara, grandson of Ellen, and the ward of court attended Trinity, but only from mid-January 1615 until some unspecified time in 1616. Therefore, there seems to be no basis whatever for the assertion of Dr. J.P. Mahaffey in his book, An Epoch of Irish History, published 1903, that Fergal was a student in Trinity College, Dublin, from his 12th to his 18th year. It should perhaps be mentioned that Fergal's purported period as a student in Trinity College early in the 17th century prompted various authors, mainly in the 19th century, to suggest he may well have conformed to the established or Protestant Church. While his patron or guardian, Sir Theobald Dillon, had indeed conformed, there is no evidence that Fergal ever did so. In fact, as Mary O'Dowd mentions in her entry on Fergal in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, most of Dillon's family adhered to Catholicism, and she goes on to remark that the Dillons had strong connections with the Franciscan order. She notes, for example, that one of Dillon's sons, Edward, called in religion Father Louis, held the position of novice master in the Irish College at Louvain in the 1620s. That's an institution I'll be mentioning fairly frequently here. While another of Lord Dillon's sons, George, was guardian of the Franciscan convent in Athlone in the late 1620s. That too was where the wife of Sir Theobald and the mother of the two Franciscans just mentioned was buried. In addition, two of Sir Theobald's daughters, Eleanor and Cecily, were members of the Poor Clare order, and in due course Cecily was elected abbess of the Poor Clare convent in Galway. So we move on then in 1623 and 24 we find Fergal named as O'Gara Farrell, reported to be living in the townland of Coppana and the eastern shores of Lough Gara. Coppanach, apparently a place of cups or goblets. There's a lot of drinking went on there in times past. The next mention of him appears to be in 1634, in other words, a gap of a full decade, when the two representatives for County Sligo appointed to the Dublin Parliament of that year were Tig O'Connor Sligo and Fergal O'Gara. Regrettably, no further details are given of Fergal's time as MP for County Sligo. So that's the really frustrating thing about reading about Fergal, that he just mentioned and then jumps on maybe 10 years and none of the details that you'd love to find. Maybe they're lying in some obscure document somewhere, but they haven't come to light so far. Then, when the Great Rebellion broke out in 1641, again we're taking a jump of 7 years, we learned that Fergal O'Gara was among those caught up in the maelstrom of violence that swept across much of the northern half of Ireland, including County Sligo. Mary O'Dowd outlines clearly the necessary preconditions for rebellion that existed at the time, and she gave them as follows: popular discontent at the Church of Ireland collection of tithes, encouraged by the expanding and well-organised Catholic Church, a number of landed gentry with financial and other grievances, and an increased political awareness, and a large body of men ready and anxious for military action. So all the things were there to set off the fireworks, as it were. Professor O'Dowd, however, draws attention to the cautious attitude to the outbreak of rebellion on the part of a number of landlords from Gaelic families. Individuals, she says, such as Fergal O'Gara, Tig O'Higgin and Tig Riwach O'Dowd and their families had much to lose through rebellion. They were from families who had successfully survived one rebellion in the 1590s with Red Hugh O'Donnell and Hugh O'Neill, and they were reluctant to risk all by becoming involved in another. When the rebellion broke out in County Sligo, there were many acts of great brutality directed especially at Protestants, usually settlers, both landlords and tenants, many of whom had recently arrived from England and particularly from Scotland. Especially targeted were ministers of religion and others associated with the established church. It was in this context that an interesting reference was made to Fergal O'Gara. This occurs in a rather controversial work, one of the so-called 1641 depositions. In this case, depositions concerning murders and robberies committed in the county of Sligo. That's the official title. It's now preserved in a manuscript in Trinity College, Dublin. The depositions have gained considerable notoriety because of their later use as the basis for a virulent campaign of anti-Catholic propaganda, and when handled with care, they can sometimes yield interesting information. So very often you have to read between the lines. But having mentioned Protestants being violently attacked and their possessions looted, Mary O'Dowd cites an entry from Wood Martin's Great History of Sligo. This quotes from the deposition of one Jane Brown, wife of William Brown of Kilvarnet, elsewhere described as wife of the Registrar of Killala and O'Connery, dated the 8th of January 1643, that's really the first month of 1644, after recounting a series of atrocities she had witnessed, including the murder by the rebellious captains and their confederates of one William Oliphant, vicar of Balsadare and Enna, of Margaret Careless, a midwife, and Henry Norman, and the minister George Ray. Mrs. Brown goes on to declare as follows: this deponent says that some of the said captains and their confederates did also at the same time bring this deponent out of the said castle of Temple House, being then great with child, and 3 of her children, and being likewise stripped, did carry them to the gallows, where the before mentioned parties had been hanged, to be by them also hanged and executed. But it pleased God to preserve this deponent and her said children from their bloody intentions. So as this deponent and her said children, being left destitute of all livelihood, did beg up and down the county of Sligo a quarter of a year at least, and had been starved and killed for not going to mass, had not Fergal O'Gara, Esquire, charitably preserved and relieved this deponent and her said children for a long time, and so on. She says then that Sir Charles Coote came to their rescue. This brief reference to Fergal is really tantalising. What we would not give for further details of what would appear to have been a very courageous action on the part of the Lord of Coolivin. The only other reference we have found to Fergal in the period just after the outbreak of the Rising of 1641 occurs in the 17th century pro-Gaelic work called An Aphorismical Discovery of Treasonable Faction. It's just as biased on the Catholic side as the other work, the depositions are on the Protestant side. But this reveals, albeit with minimal context, that Fergal had sent his son John with a company of men to support the celebrated military leader of Gaelic Ulster, Nollaig Ó Muraíle. The wording of the text is as follows: Mr. Fergal O'Gara presented himself to General Neil cheerfully and prayed for his good success, and told him he longed for him and for somebody of the Irish by which he expected comfort, and sent his son, Captain John Gara, with his company to him. Now, Father Brendan Jennings, in his book Micheál Cleary, Chief of the Four Masters, published in 1936, when speaking of Fergal's role at this time, says, he was openly on this side of the Catholic Confederates, and not only welcomed Nollaig Ó Muraíle, but sent him assistance. Mary O'Dowd, in her entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, refers to O'Gara's stance at this time as follows. She said, in 1642 he was among those who welcomed the arrival of Nollaig Ó Muraíle to Ireland to take command of the Confederate army, in which his son John served as a captain. One commentator, Father Fergus Barriad, in his article on Moygara in the book Mascara I Gubna Vichili Cleary, which was published in 1944, suggests that Fergal could not himself risk joining Noll's army at this time for one reason or another, but was happy that his son John should support the insurgent cause. And I suppose we should remember, know that the outbreak of war, of that particular war, that uprising, would culminate a decade later in the horrific Cromwellian reign of terror. But that's another subject we could go into at another time. But the dangerous complications of the period are revealed by Mary O'Dowd when she mentions that in March 1643 an order was issued by the Confederate Assembly in Kilkenny for the arrest of 16 men in County Sligo for having committed massacres, outrages and robberies in the early days of the rebellion. And this, the Confederate Assembly was sort of the Catholic Parliament for Ireland at the time, that was set up after the rebellion started. And details of the individuals in question are revealed in the following passage. The 16 included Tig O'Connor Sligo and his two brothers, and other O'Connors and O'Harts, as well as Andrew Crane, and, as Mayor Dowd says, most surprisingly of all, Fergal O'Gara. It is not clear if the order to arrest all these men was carried out, but Tig O'Connor and his brothers were certainly apprehended. There were reports indeed that O'Connor Sligo was to be executed, but was later released. Again, what we wouldn't give to get more details of that. It's just left like that, and I've seen no other details in relation to it. In O'Dowd's view, it appears that the leaders of the Confederacy based in Kilkenny disliked the way in which the rebellion had developed in Sligo, and the result of this was, quote, the exclusion of many of the initial leaders from any further decision-making role during the subsequent war. Once again, we're left frustratingly without any further details of this intriguing development. Moving on some years to March 1650, we find a brief but interesting reference to Fergal in a document preserved in the Vatican archives, where it was discovered just over a half a century ago by a man from this part of the country, borders of Mayo and Roscommon, actually born in Boyle, I think, Father Cathalis Gibran, OFM. In that document, Fergal was listed among 13 leading men of Connacht who had signed a petition to the Pope to appoint a Franciscan priest named Father Francis O'Connor to be Bishop of Elphin. The petition, however, was in vain, and Elphin was left without a bishop until the appointment of Dominic Burke, who was a Dominican, in 1671. In the aftermath of the Cromwellian Wars, as pointed out by Maura O'Gara, much of County Sligo land was confiscated and distributed to Cromwellian officers and soldiers and English officials. In 1653, the tenants of Coolivin where Fergal owned most of the land, were ordered to leave the district. People, cattle and goods were to vacate the area by the following year. The same author notes that Fergal of Moygara, obviously our Fergal, was named among the 28 former County Sligo landowners who lodged an appeal in 1664, which was after the Restoration, to have their lands restored. It's plausibly suggested that this is evidence that Fergal was still living in the mid-1660s. In further support of this is the fact that a man named Fergal O'Gara was recorded in the townland of Ardconnell in the parish of Emlafad, some miles north of Moygara, as the only person with the hearth in the tax rolls or hearth money rolls of 1663. This would appear to be virtually the sum total of all that can be established with any certainty about the life story of Fergal O'Gara, with one notable exception that I will come to presently. In this respect, however, I should mention Fergal was not alone in leaving behind him, in the Ireland of his day, quite a modest trail of evidence. One might compare him to certain other contemporaries in 17th century Ireland. For example, two noted Gaelic scholars, Micheál Ó Cléiri from South Donegal and Dubhaltach Mac Iarraidh from West Sligo. Those two have bequeathed to us a substantial body of written literature, mainly in Irish, from which we can extract a considerable amount of often valuable biographical detail, usually in the form of marginal notes and colophons. But it has often occurred to me that had much of this material been lost, as happened to so much that was penned in Irish in the war toward the 17th century, we would be hard-pressed to write even the slenderest of biographical notices on either Ó Cléiri or Mac Iarraidh. So that arguably is probably what happened in the case of Fergal O'Gara. There probably would have been a great deal of information about him floating around and in documentary form and so on, but all gone now, clear. The notable exception I mentioned in relation to Fergal a minute ago has to do with his dealings with Micheál Ó Cléiri and his great work on all of the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland, or better known as the Annals of the Four Masters. Now, to begin with, I'll just move on to say something about Micheál Ó Cléiri, one of the most remarkable people in the history of Irish learning. I'll give a brief outline of his life and work. Micheál was a Franciscan lay brother from South Donegal, born in the early 1590s, 1590 or a year or two later. His original name was Tig, and he was nicknamed Tig and Slave, Tig of the Mountain, for reasons that are unclear, while his name and religion was Micheál or Michael. So little is known of his early life, but he was believed to have spent a period on the continent as a layman, perhaps, according to one or two versions, as a soldier, before entering the house of Franciscan friars in Louvain, or now Leuven, in present-day Belgium, in 1623. A brother of his, Moygara, was in the order since 1619, and indeed was later ordained as Father Bernardine. In 1626, Brother Micheál, who actually never advanced to the priesthood, for we don't know whether he wanted to become a priest or not, but he was sent back to Ireland with orders to collect materials for a great research project on the lives of early Irish saints. The project was the brainchild of two Louvain Franciscans, Hugh Ward and Patrick Fleming, or Éamach Ward and Paul Clem. The instructions given to Brother Micheál were very strict. He was to travel throughout Ireland in search of the materials in question, and those that were not given to him, even on loan, were to be meticulously transcribed. This was the era before photocopiers and whatnot. But he was told he was not permitted to change a single word of anything that he was transcribing. He was to write exactly as he found it. Such an approach was utterly at odds with the practice of Irish scribes, who were noted for changing and correcting, as they thought, their source materials, often to such an extent that their completed versions often bore little resemblance to the original. Everyone thought he was better than whoever wrote the original thing, and the results are there to see. Brother Micheál, while in Ireland, was attached to the Franciscan House of Donegal, and this has misled people into thinking he was based in Donegal town. In fact, by then, the friars had been banished from the town, and were living apparently in a modest farmhouse on the banks of the River Drowse, just south of Bundoran. The Drowse actually forms the boundary between Ulster and Connacht, and between counties Donegal and Leitrim. And this led to a lively debate in the 1950s and 60s as to whether Brother Michal's work was completed in Donegal or in Leitrim, whether it was an Ulster or a Connacht work. And the matter was never really resolved. The man who led the campaign for the suggestion that it was written in Connacht was a Connacht man, Nollaig Ó Muraíle from Dunchambo, brother of Joe Mooney's. And he kept up this campaign until he died. And I think we have to say we don't know. O'Cleary mentions being at the Drowse, on the Drowse, all that, but never says which side of the river he was. So then I know a man from Bundoran who claims that he has part of the house, some stones from the house, in his own house, and he claims they are the remains of the house in which the work was done. But again, I don't know if there's any way of proving or disproving that. O'Cleary's practice was to work at the Drowse, on Drowish in Irish, in what we may term the Donegal house during the winter, and throughout the rest of the year to travel throughout Ireland in search of source material for his great project. Fortunately, while working tirelessly at his transcriptions, he usually noted meticulously where the material had been found or where he was doing the transcription. At the beginning of his sojourn in Ireland, however, Brother Michal was not quite so careful to do this, so we're unsure of some of the details of his first year or so in Ireland. For example, we don't know the precise date of his arrival back in his homeland. It has been suggested that he arrived in summertime, which makes sense, but we can't be more precise than that. Or when precisely he took up residence in the Donegal house beside the River Drowse. Presumably he spent the early months there in preparation for the work that lay ahead of him. We don't know, however, how many others were in the house with them, or whether many of them had much expertise in the kind of work he was to undertake, or did they just think he was a strange individual doing something we know nothing about, and they just let him get on with his work. We'd love to hear some of the gossip as well, but we don't have that. It would appear that Brother Michal may have remained in the Donegal house until the late summer or early autumn of 1627, for later in that autumn we find him far from the shores of Donegal Bay in Leinster, where he located and copied material in Dublin, in Drogheda and in Kildare. Drogheda because that was the home of the very learned Protestant primate James Usher, one of the most learned men in Europe at his time, and a very strongly anti-Catholic individual, despite the fact that a lot of his own family remained Catholic. He had a nephew, I think, who was a Jesuit, but and despite his obvious bias against Catholicism, he gave help to the likes of Brother Michal and other Irish scholars. He had the finest library in Ireland. Somebody said a lot of the stolen, that's another matter. But he was very liberal with and generous in helping Irish scholars, a lot of them clerics, to come in and to copy from his manuscripts and so on. So one of the another fascinating aspect of Irish life. Regrettably, while giving details of where he was writing, Brother Michal, however, never tells us how he travelled, whether it was on foot or on horseback. Apparently, Franciscan rules did not look favourably on friars taking the easy option of travel on horseback. Yet carrying documents and sometimes complete manuscripts as well as pens, ink, paper and so on his back as he trudged around Ireland would surely have slowed and handicapped him greatly. So maybe if he did go on horseback, he probably decided wise not to mention it. After a midwinter sojourn back in the Donegal house, Brother Michal had returned to Dublin by midsummer 1628, and in the autumn moved on to Carlow, and from there to Cashel in County Tipperary, in South Tipperary, and sometime in the course of that year, presumably before setting out for Dublin, he completed a version of a work on medieval Irish saints called in Irish Féilear Naomh Néireann, the calendar of the saints of Ireland, known in English as the Martyrology of Donegal, now preserved in the Royal Library in Brussels, and it's a work that was compiled with the assistance of another important Donegal scholar of the same surname as Brother Micheál. Indeed, I think he was a distant cousin. This was Cúchugri, son of Diarmaid Ó Muraíle. He was from the parish of Kilbarn in southwest Donegal, which was Brother Micheál's own home parish. In fact, Cúchugri had come to the attention of the Louvain Franciscans some 4 years earlier in 1624 when he contacted the Donegal convent to get Cúchugri to adapt 2 metrical martyrologies to a format that was required by the Roman authorities. In other words, the list of Irish saints, the way they were written and so on, didn't appeal to the authorities in Rome. They wanted more specific details, which was kind of asking for a lot in many cases. But still, the Franciscans in Louvain decided they should cooperate, and therefore that's how Cúchugri was brought into the picture. And it was also mentioned at the time that Cúchugri was well versed in the Irish language and had a fine collection of old books suited to the task of adapting the martyrologies. So he was really important and on the scene before Micheál arrived. His first draft of the work was completed in 1626, around the time that Brother Micheál arrived back in Donegal, and the two were then put to work immediately to produce a thoroughly revised version of the calendar of Irish saints. This was brought to completion by midsummer 1628, so they didn't lose any time, just before Micheál set out for Dublin for the second time, and from there travelled to Carlow and to Cashel. It seems unlikely that Micheál returned to the banks of the Drowse that winter, for when we next meet him in spring 1629, he was still in Tipperary, so he would hardly have gone from Tipperary to Donegal and back again in a really short time. and then after that he moved on to Athlone and then to Multifarnham, County Westmeath, site of a well-known Franciscan house still surviving as it happens. He then returned to the Donegal house, but by midsummer was back again in Munster, moving on to Wexford, then to Clonmel, then to County Cork, and north then through Limerick and Clare to South Galway. And by November he was back again beside the Drowse. For much of 1630, Brother Micheál worked in the Donegal house, producing, among other works, a second version of the Martyrology of Donegal. It's the same basic text, but a lot more notes and comments and commentary and so on. And both of the manuscripts now are together in Brussels. I was in Brussels, or in Leuven about 10 years ago, and the Royal Library in Brussels had lent the 2 manuscripts for the course of a week during the conference, and it was great to be able to see the 2 manuscripts side by side and compare from page to page. So these were some of the items that survived against all the odds. Later in that year, 1630, Micheál was working this time with 3 assistants. The 3 are, again, Cúchugri seems to have been a very popular name at the time, like it disappeared totally shortly after that. But the 3 that were working with them were Farfassa Ó Muraíle, a man from County Roscommon, Cúchugri Ó Muraíle, whom we've already mentioned, and another Cúchugri Ó Muraíle, a Leitrim man. They were based in a house near Athlone under the patronage of Turlough McCaughlin, MP. Again, he's shared a lot of things with Fergal O'Gara. He was MP in the next Parliament after Fergal's appointment. And he was also a nephew of the Franciscan scholar Father Nollaig Ó Muraíle. This appears to have been the first example we have of Brother Micheál working as part of a group, other than just working along with Cúchugri, and doing so with the help of a patron. The fruit of that cooperative venture was a work whose title in English is The History of the Kings of Ireland and Genealogies of Irish Saints. Not a very large work, but an interesting one all the same. Returning to the Drowse again, Brother Micheál worked there for most of 1631, and then from October to Christmas, he and 4 assistants The three I've already mentioned, Farfassa, Wilconnor, Cuchulainn O'Clery, and Cuchulainn O'Digan, together with the fourth, Gilaporic O'Linian, Leonard from Fermanagh. O'Linian is a great Fermanagh name, famous learned family. They worked in the Franciscan house at Liscool, County Fermanagh, under the patronage of Brian Moygara, Baron of Enniskillen. The result of these labours was a new edition of the Nollaig Ó Muraíle, the so-called Book of Invasions, a book which purported to recount the legendary history of early Ireland. So then, moving on now, we find O'Clery working on material rather different to what went before after this. Rather than restricting themselves to the lives of early Irish saints, as he had been ordered to do, Micheál and his associates had begun in 1630 broadening the scope of their work, tackling more secular subjects such as the pedigrees of early Irish kings and the legendary Nollaig Ó Muraíle. Then, in January 1632, they commenced work on the compilation of a work of remarkable ambition, the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland. And here a brief word of explanation about what's meant by annals. These are works recording events that happen year by year, annually, often drawing on notes written more or less contemporaneously. They were designed to form the basis later for the production of reliable books of history. The annals I've just mentioned, the so-called Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland, actually they were never given a formal title. Even the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland doesn't appear on in the document itself. They were compiled by Brother Micheál and his small team of helpers beside the River Drowse, and significantly they were produced under the patronage of, this is the third patron they got, Fergal O'Gara MP. The first part of the great work, running from the earliest times to the year AD 1208, was completed by the end of the year 1632. So they were working very, very quick, because the amount of work they did in a short time was very substantial. Regrettably, no details are given of the negotiations that must have preceded Fergal O'Gara's agreeing to finance this very significant project. The political background to him granting financial and other support to Brother Micheál and various assistants is covered by Bernadette Cunningham in her fine study, The Annals of the Four Masters, Irish History, Kingship and Society in the early 17th century, which appeared in 2010. Dr. Cunningham suggests, for example, that Fergal O'Gara's agreement to act as patron to Brother Micheál's project may well have been influenced by the example of fellow members of the Gaelic aristocracy, such as Turlough MacCaughlan and Brian Moygara. As we have seen, MacCaughlan in 1630 provided patronage for the production of the history of the Kings of Ireland and genealogies of Irish saints, while Moygara in 1631 supported the new edition of the Book of Invasions. And Bernard Cunningham observes that the compilers of these annals made extensive use of a wide range of manuscript sources in the Irish language, made available by learned families and others from many parts of the country. But she points out a fascinating thing: they rarely look to East Ulster or to Scotland for their sources, for reasons that aren't clear, whether it's just a certain provincial attitude, maybe that West Ulster were intended to look down on East Ulster and didn't bother, and the O'Donnells wouldn't give strong the support of the O'Donnells, which were the names. O'Clery. The O'Clerys were working for they were kind of propagandists for the O'Donnells, and therefore they wouldn't give too much credit to the O'Neills, their great rivals. So that might be one of the reasons. And Scotland is strange, because a lot of Irish writers at the time in Irish would have considered Scotland kind of an extension of the Gaelic world, and would have used certain poems and so on. But Micheál seems to have no particular interest in the Scottish dimension. And he makes no specific mention of manuscripts of O'Neill provenance, either hagiographical or historical. And Bernard Cunningham also makes the remark that the Four Masters, unlike, say, their contemporary, the celebrated Munster poet and historian Geoffrey Keating, they relied almost totally on Irish manuscript sources and didn't generally consider it appropriate to incorporate material from external printed sources. In other words, they stuck to Irish manuscript sources alone. They didn't bother with any other kind of material, which is interesting. One result of this approach was that some of the coverage by the four masters was rather restricted and somewhat narrow in focus, but we had other good things that could be said about it. Now, turning to the final phase of Mícheál's labours, the final third of his sojourn in Ireland, we find that in the 3-year period, 1633 to 35, he produced a number of valuable texts. For example, by August 1633, and still based beside the Drows, he completed a copy of a medieval religious work called the Martyrology of Gorman. It's likely, however, that he spent much of that year, and at least the first half of 1634, compiling material for the second half of the Annals. But by summer 1634, he was back in County Clare collecting further material on the lives of the Irish saints. Apparently he discovered, or somebody contacted him in the meantime, said, "You better come back down here, there's some other useful stuff here," and he obviously headed off. And again, I think that even whether he was walking or going by horseback, it was quite a hike all the way from down the west coast down to Clare. In May 1635, I'm hoping my voice holds out. 1635, we see Brother Mícheál now back in the Donegal house, penning the life of Saint Macbeth, an obscure enough saint with links with North Clare. And in November, he made a copy of another famous work, The War of the Gaels and the Foreigners, Cogga Gael Regalim, the foreigners being the Vikings. It's a kind of a hagiographical work in praise mainly of Brian Boru and the O'Briens. But throughout the same year, he also continued working on the second part of the Annals from AD 1208 onwards, down finally finished with a note of the death of Hugh O'Neill in Rome in July 1616. And he was doing all of this with the assistance of others, all of whom have been mentioned previously, Farfaston Wilconner, Cucoglio Cleary, and Cucoglio Dignon. But in addition, he had part-time assistance from two others, Muirish, son of Torna Ó Muraíle, another Connacht man, for the space just of a month, and Conora Ó Cleary, who was a brother of Brother Mícheál. We know nothing else, just that he crops up, his name is mentioned. By early 1636, the Annals were complete, and in April, for the last time in the Donegal house, Brother Mícheál penned a work called The Saint Lord of Ireland, Niamh Hananas Niamh in Trefoil, a poetic work on Irish saints. Then in autumn of that year, 1636, he set out southwards to seek approbations of his work from scholars and churchmen in counties Tipperary, Clare and Galway. On reaching the Poor Clare convent of Bethlehem on the shores of Lough Ree, County Westmeath, the abbess there prevailed upon him to make a clean copy for the sisters of an Irish translation of part of the Rule of St. Clare. The translation had originally been made some time before by two Franciscan priests, A. O'Reilly and Seamus O'Shiel. So he produced that translation or transcribed the translation, and then moved on and continued searching for people who would be considered experts in the area or would have authority. So he aimed mainly for bishops and well-known Gaelic scholars to write pieces in praise of what he had written. There's another side to the story where a fellow Franciscan, Nollaig Ó Muraíle, wasn't a fan of his, and he started a campaign against him, and it caused unholy eruptions that went on for years, and it's something that has never been examined in complete detail. And he claimed that Mícheál wasn't up to the job in places, and that he was biased against some parts of Connacht. He mentioned Roscommon often enough, things like that. So that's another side. It shows you even among your own crowd, they can get stabbed in the back in academic matters, I suppose. So, poor old Micheál was dead before the thing really came to a head, and there were large gatherings of Franciscans. This was kind of on the eve of Cromwell coming to Ireland and whatnot, but they were devoted to bitter debates about what manuscripts had been used and whether certain things had been left out and all that. So what was the old thing about academic quarrels, that they're always so bitter because the stakes are so low. Henry Kissinger was famously called a free saying before that. Anyway, so early anyway, in 1637, Micheál O'Clery travelled one last time to Kildare and Dublin to get approbations from the Bishop of the former, the Bishop of Kildare, and the Archbishop of Dublin, who both happened to be Franciscans. And after that, he may have returned one last time to the Nollaig Ó house beside the Drowse. He doesn't say. There's a gap in that year. We don't know what he was doing between, we say, January, February 1637 and July, when we find him at Carrickfergus, County Antrim, about to embark on the long journey back to Louvain. When I think I drove through a rather very strongly loyalist area in West Belfast yesterday, and the place was covered with Union Jacks. So I was thinking of Micheál going through Carrickfergus in 1637, and the place newly planted, the foundation of the plantation. So he does, unfortunately, he doesn't talk about it. It's just mentioned that he went that way. Some years later, he published an Irish dictionary, the first one ever printed in Irish. It was actually printed in Louvain. But around the time of his publication, he died, probably in late 1643. Again, unfortunately, we don't know, did he ever see the thing in print? We don't know the precise date for his death. It's one of these amazing things. The man who left him, to whom we are so indebted for information, all that kind of aspect of Irish history. We know so little about his own life outside of the work that he was doing in order to do. And as I say, we don't. As a result, we don't know the precise date of his death. We don't even know where precisely he's buried. He's buried in Louvain, and there was some excavations done at the college a few years ago when they were doing some renovation work, and they came on 6 skeletons. But they said that's no good. We don't even know what kind of man he was. We don't know, was he a big, tall man or a small man? Was he fat or thin? It's amazing that we owe so much to him, and yet we know so little about him in that sense. It should also be noted that neither of the 2 Franciscan scholars responsible for sending Brother Micheál on his remarkable travels around Ireland were there to witness his return to Louvain. Father Patrick Fleming had been murdered near Prague in 1631. He ran into a group of Lutherans who just attacked him for no reason and just killed him, while Father Hugh Ward had died in 1635. Their place had been taken by another great Nollaig Ó scholar, Father John Colgan, from Inishowen, the man who famously dubbed Micheál O'Clery and his team of assistants the Quatuor Magistri, the 4 masters. Before leaving the subject, it should be emphasised that the compilation of the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland was a truly remarkable undertaking. First, we may note the sheer size of the work, running to an estimated total of about 380,000 words. This is the famous edition produced in 1849-51 by John O'Donovan, work will never be, and this is just 1 volume, 7 volumes of that, and it's one of the greatest works ever written in Ireland, or published in Ireland. I mean, O'Donovan's edition is an astonishing work. It makes it anyway by far the largest of Irish annalistic collections, next in size with the Annals of Ulster, with about 190,000 words, or roughly half the size of the Annals of the 4 Masters. It's most regrettable that we've no details of the interaction between Micheál O'Clery and Fergal O'Gara, the man whose patronage made possible the compilation of what is acknowledged to be the greatest of our annalistic collections. As we've already seen, Fergal was the third patron to that little group of scholars managed to acquire, the others being, as I said, Turner McCaughlin and Nollaig Ó Muraíle. Now, one or two other points I think I should mention. A strange suggestion that was made over 60 years ago in an article entitled Fergal O'Gara and the Four Masters, published in the Irish Ecclesiastical Record in 1963 by Alexander Boyle. In this advanced the idea that an Augustinian priest, Fergal O'Gara, known for his compilation of a very valuable collection of Irish classical poetry, might in fact have been identical to our Fergal O'Gara of Moygara, patron of the Four Masters. The basis for this far-fetched theory was that in the aftermath of the rising of 1641, the Lord of Coolabin was thought to have disappeared from view, thus giving rise to the suggestion that he may have gone to the continent and there been ordained a priest. Since the controversial article appeared in 1963, our knowledge of the life and work of Fergal has so far advanced that we can now utterly dismiss Boyle's theory. Fergal, we now know, was a native of the townland of Sheshugari in the parish of Achonry. Joining the Augustinian order at Ardnaree, he took the name Father Nicholas, and for a time he went to study in Spain. We find him in Seville at the end of 1640, having been there for the previous 3 years. And a letter addressed to him arrived from Nantes, sent by an Augustinian friar named Donald MacSwivne, whom he had known from their time together in Ardnaree. This and another letter, both in Irish, had been intercepted by the Spanish authorities, and they couldn't make it out. It was written in Irish, and so they arrested Fergal and another Augustinian priest called Father Brian O'Higgin, and forced them under threat of torture to provide a Spanish translation. And of course, all it is it's a letter from home, or talking about home, and telling how one of them mentions about how the mother had sent him a new shirt, and talking gossip about things down around Madrid and that area. That's where the mother lived, or father and mother lived. But anyway, it's still in the Spanish archives, Salamanca's, and I had never heard of it. About 7 or 8 years ago, I got a letter from a Spanish student in Salamanca's, saying that he had this letter, and he thought it was Irish. He had a small Irish himself, so he sent me a copy, and he asked me would I translate it, so I did, and I sent it off to him. I was very pleased with myself. I said, no, I might make an article of that sometime. And 3 weeks later, a friend of mine, Corey O'Mahon, professor in Cork, contacted me. He said, I've got this letter that was sent in the 17th century, and he said, it's very interesting. And I said, oh, have you? And he said, what are you doing? I said, oh, I will translate it, and I have an article ready for Irish historical studies. I know one of the other journals. So I said, right, well, here, I let you what I let you have my notes as well. So he was able to use them, because some of the local gossip I was able to link with people or individuals I knew of. So between us, it was published anyway, and it's there for, and there's also the Spanish translation. So anyway, that's how did I get on to that? So after both letters, still held in Salamanca's, shed fascinating light on aspects of Gaelic life in Connacht and on the continent on the eve of the rebellion of 1641. They were written in 1641, just on the eve of the rebellion. Sometime after this, Father O'Gara returned to Ireland, but he was banished against the continent when the Cromwellian regime took over. While in exile in the Low Countries between 1655 and 59, he compiled mainly at Lille and Brussels the aforementioned collection of more than 150 Irish poems, the manuscript of which 224 pages now survive at the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin. Seems to have originally contained 203 items of verse, but by 1686 40 pages containing 24 poems had been lost, although several other pieces had been inserted in the meantime. Sometime after the Restoration in 1660, Fergal returned to Ireland and who was appointed prior of Ardnaree. In 1670 he was transferred to Banada in this county, and in 1673 to Ballinrobe in Mayo, where he was head of the community. An address to the reader added to the manuscript in 1686 has a strong resemblance to a text by another Sligo scholar, the poet Sean Moygara. Indeed, it has recently been suggested that the address may actually be in Sean O'Gara's hand, suggesting the possibility of a blood relationship between Sean and Fergal Dhu. Regrettably, there seems to be no further record of Fergal Dhu. For example, we don't even know the date of his death. It's one of these amazing things that somebody can have done so it's important work and just disappear. Anyway, the main point is Fergal Dhu was not Fergal or Fergal O'Gara. Now, one final thing I thought I should mention something about some offspring of Fergal O'Gara or Moygara. A subject that has been treated in some detail by Nollaig Ó Muraíle, and I'm only going to summarise something here. We've already come across Fergal's son, Captain John O'Gara, who, as you recall, had joined the army of Nollaig Ó Muraíle in the early 1640s. This John was married to Mary O'Connor, grandaunt of Charles O'Connor of Ballinrobe and Kieran O'Connor's ancestor. The famous 18th century, Charles was a famous 18th century Irish scholar, historian and campaigner for Catholic rights. John and Mary had a son, Colonel Oliver, who fought in the Battle of Aughrim in July 1691, and after the signing of the ill-starred Treaty of Limerick, left for France with several thousand other Irish soldiers. Oliver married Mary Fleming, daughter of Lord Slane, Slane Castle in Meath, and on settling in France they had 11 children, 7 of whom survived. Several of their offspring, like many more of the so-called wild geese, served with distinction in many continental armies throughout the 18th century, most notably the French, Spanish and Austrian. 2 members of the O'Gara family, apparently grandsons of Fergal, who feature in the ecclesiastical history of the Diocese of Tuam, were in turn archbishops of the Western Archdiocese. The first was Brian, or also referred to as Bernard, whom we first meet as parish priest of my own home parish, Knock, around 1715. 8 years later, in December 1723, he was appointed Archbishop of Tuam, in which post he served until his death on the 3rd of April 1740. Incidentally, the only record of the precise date of Brian O'Gara's death occurs in a note inserted by the scholar Charles O'Connor in one of the autographed volumes of the Annals of the Four Masters, that was at the time in O'Connor's hands. This was a very difficult period of history in the history of Irish Catholicism, shortly after the enactment of the notorious penal laws. During his time as Archbishop, those laws were being applied with particular vigour. As Brian was deemed by the civil authorities to be merely a titular bishop, referred to as Brian Gara, the reputed Popish Archbishop, and not permitted even to live in Ireland, he could not risk taking up residence near the historic Episcopal See in Tuam. Instead, he appears to have lived in the townland of Carrickmackintyre, or Carromack as it's called locally, about 4 miles southwest of Ballyhonus, where members of the family had a substantial holding in the mid-18th century. In 1752, the proprietor of the townland was said to be the Honourable Anthony Malone, while one Farrell O'Gara was tenant of 182 acres of the townland. Regrettably, there appears to be no evidence as to what precisely may have been the relation between this Farrell O'Gara and Fergal Moygara. I'm sure there was some connection. What were deemed to be the ruins of Archbishop Brian's house in Carrickmackintyre were still pointed out locally up to about 80 years ago. There's also strong evidence he used a nearby church, Kildara Chapel, also called Turrahan Chapel, a short distance from Carromack, as his cathedral. The chapel was situated within the Kildara Cemetery, and part of its walls remained until 1888, when the stones were removed and used to build a new schoolhouse nearby. But a local man, D.A. Grave, around 1940, came across part of the foundation and was able to tell its precise situation. Turrahan Chapel, being used as O'Gara's seat, was the scene of some quite dramatic activity in those years. The Archbishop became involved, for example, in what's referred to as the age-old jurisdictional dispute between the Archdiocese and the Wardens of Galway. This led to a great deal of acrimonious correspondence, excommunications and appeals to Rome. Basically, the Wardenship of Galway was regarded as being independent of all local diocesan authorities and so on. And the relations were anything but cordial or Christian, let's say. And some at least of Archbishop O'Gara's fulminations against the recalcitrant clergy of Galway were issued from the altar of that church. The Archbishop also became embroiled in a bitter row with Lord Athenry, one of the Norman family of de Birmingham, who in 1726 had converted to Protestantism. Intervening in the dispute led to the Irish House of Lords twice ordering O'Gara's arrest. The order was never enforced, but for a time Brian O'Gara thought it best to go by what was referred to as the highly respectable and Protestant name of George Fowler. In the year before his death, Archbishop Brian ordered a tomb to be erected over the grave of his father, Charles O'Gara, in the Augustinian Friary in Ballyhonus. It's still to be seen forming part of a small altar on the left-hand side as you go in the main door of the friary. The inscription on it reads as follows: INRI, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, and then IHS, Jesus, and then pray for the souls of Charles O'Gara and family, for whom this tomb was made by his son Bernard, Archbishop of Tuam, Anno Domini 1739. Brian or Bernard was quickly succeeded as Archbishop less than 7 months after his death by his brother Michael. We knew that it's the only time it happened certainly in Tuam that, or I don't know if there's any other cases, well, not very many cases in Ireland of brother succeeding brother, certainly after the Reformation. But Michael was appointed on the 19th of September 1740, following a postulation sent to Rome by the parish priests of the diocese. Archbishop Michael had spent several years in Spain prior to his appointment. He was rector of the Irish College of Alcalá de Henares, just east of Madrid, from 1728 to 1740. Following his appointment to Tuam, he appears to have kept an exceptionally low profile. As a government informer writing from Loughrea in 1744 was compelled to confess, "Titular Archbishop of Tuam is one O'Gara, cannot learn his Christian name nor where he lives." It occurred to me that probably Michael was probably fairly elderly when he was appointed, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he wasn't terribly active. So that, in barest outline, is the story of Brother Micheál O'Clery and the remarkable work he accomplished over a period of nearly 11 years, from 1626 to 1637, during a very difficult and dangerous period of Irish history. This amazing man travelled tirelessly throughout Ireland and saved from almost inevitable oblivion an enormous body of invaluable written material, almost entirely in the Irish language, all of it written by hand with a quill pen. A lot of that material had to do with the relentless struggle of Irish Catholicism to survive in the face of brutal persecution, but it also includes some of the most important documentary material relating to the history of Ireland from earliest times down to the early 17th century. And a significant portion of the story has to do with the patriotic generosity of an interesting man from this area, Fergal O'Gara, Lord of Coolivin, who made possible the compilation of a remarkable work of learning, the greatest collection of Irish annals, the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland, or of the Four Masters. The only problem with all of this, must be conceded, is that there are so many frustrating gaps in our knowledge. As I have mentioned on several occasions, there's so much more we would love to know about Fergal O'Gara, or indeed about Micheál O'Clery. Sadly, many of those gaps can probably never be filled, so we must be grateful for what has thus far been brought to light. Go to the Monday.
Thank you very much, Nollaig. I think that we'll all agree that that was a talk well worth waiting for, and I just say to Nollaig, thank you very much for your very good piece on Fergal O'Gara and his connections with the Annals of the Four Masters. It's something that we mention all the time when we're talking about Moygara, and people ask us who built a castle like that, and what was their thinking behind it and everything like that. And then we go into the talk about Fergal and the sort of person he was, and we can see that he was very far thinking at the time, and could see that all these histories were about to be lost, and was willing to be the patron of it. Have we any questions before we finish for Nollaig? Yes.
How do we know he was the patron? How do we know that Fergal was the patron?
Sorry, without being hoarse, I'm deaf.
How do we know that he was the patron? The question is.
Well, it's mentioned, or mentioned very specifically in the very first part of this edition. There's a copy of the testimonial that Mayor O'Cleary wrote in praise of Fergal O'Gara and his generosity. It doesn't tell you an awful lot, except that he says that he was a very generous man. Well, he would say that anyway, because he was depending on him. But it's not. You'd love if he gave a little bit more information about Fergal, but at the same time, he did acknowledge that his contribution was quite enormous. Now, how much it was, we don't know. And he mentioned somewhere in the course of it, he said, and of course he said the friars in the house by the Drows provided food. So he paid. So it was Fergal just paying for the pens and ink and things like that, or what, we don't. We'd love to. Again, that's the kind of information we'd love to know. But the actually, I think. Oh yes, I have it here. The final page of this, I mentioned it. I've taken out the more relevant parts of it. I won't bother reading it out. But let's see. He says, "I beg God to bestow every happiness for body and soul on Fergal O'Gara, Lord of Moygara and Coolabed, one of the two Knights of Parliament who were elected from the county of Sligo into Dublin this year, 1634. And then I, Micheál O'Cleary, poor brother of the Order of St. Francis, having been for 10 years transcribing old material that I found concerning the saints of Ireland, observing obedience to each provincial that was in Ireland, have come before you, noble Fergal O'Gara. I have calculated on your honour that it seems to you a cause of pity and regret, grief and sorrow for the glory of God and the honour of Ireland." The Home Glory James and all in the hearing. It used to be on the banner of the Irish press. How much the race of Gael, son of Newell, have gone under a cloud and darkness without knowledge of the death or abbot of saint or virgin, archbishop, bishop, abbot, or other noble dignitary of the church, of king or prince, lord or chieftain, or the connection of one with the other. And then he says, if there were collected by me all the best and most copious books of annals that I could find throughout all Ireland, though it was difficult for me to collect them in one place, to write this book in your name and to your honour. For it was you who gave the reward of their labour to the chroniclers by whom it was written, and it was the friars of the convent of Donegal that supplied them with food and attendance in like manner. For every good that will result from this book in giving light to all in general, it is to you that thanks should be given. And then he goes on, you are of the race of Eibhear Macmillan, from whom descended 30 of the kings of Ireland and 61 saints, and to Taig, son of Gian, son of Elil Olam, from whom 18 of these saints are sprung. You can be traced generation by generation, and he gives the whole genealogy of the O'Garas at the end. And then he says that on the 22nd day of January AD 1632, this book was commenced in the convent of Donegal, and it was finished in the same convent on the 10th of August 1636, the 11th year of the reign of our King Charles over England, France, Alba, and over Ada. Your affectionate friend, Brother Micheál O'Cleary. That kind of, it gives you an idea, it's a very interesting piece like that. I don't think there's anything quite as detailed in relation to the other patrons. So I think if you read between the lines, you can get a certain amount of information from it as well.
The O'Gara's always had money and influence. Anyone else have a question?
Yeah,
Kieran.
Thanks very much for a really excellent talk. You kind of half answered, but is there a declaration of loyalty to Charles King Charles in the Annals of the Four Masters.
No,
Yeah,
apart from that, I don't.
that's it.
Yeah, I think that's it. Sure. And I mean that would be standard at the time. That, because Charles was one. He was one of us, as it were. I mean, there wasn't Moygara in his genealogies, putting the genealogy of James, King of Ireland, Scotland, and England in that order, and says he was descended from Irish kings and high kings and so on. So that was standard stuff at the time.
Because I think 1641 rebels eventually sort of declared loyalty to Charles.
They did, yeah.
Yeah, as well. That's often forgotten, you know. You know, it was the settlers they were against. And,
Well, that was it.
Not
And
not necessarily the King of England.
And they claimed to be rising out on behalf of the king.
Yeah.
And that didn't do Charles any good either, I suppose.
Anyone else?
So, was Fergal a resident in the castle during this period, or how did those numbers match up with the dates?
I think I'd have to defer to more on that, but the most we know about Fergal in the actual histories is that he kept Copenhagen for himself. Now, obviously, it looks like that he built Moygara as a kind of a status symbol of his power and influence. Now, whether he had very little time to live in it or ever had much to do with it is hard to know. But he would have been the only man with the wherewithal and the money to build something like that. But in one of the references in the histories, it says he kept Copenhagen for himself. So he would have had a tower house, a lot smaller, set up in Copenhagen, where he probably lived himself. But he lost all of that in the Cromwellian confiscations, and it looks like he ended up in where there is Niamh here, Ardconnell and Ballymote. Now, how he ended up there, maybe it was some connection with his wife who had been Taff from Ballymote and possibly had some connection with Ardconnell, which is just outside Ballymote there.
We actually argue in the book that one of the reasons why he moves to Copenhagen is to link in with the timber trade and things like that. And also, probably, as you say, he gets probably a pretty good deal. I'm not saying I'm right because there's no evidence from his Taff relatives in terms of the tenancy at Ardconnell. I mean, that's argued in the book there at the end, you know. Our idea is that somehow sort of traditional views that somebody loses everything and they're reduced to poverty. But if you look at the career, as you brought out there, Colonel Oliver O'Gara, his Taff and O'Connor cousins wouldn't have seen him short, so to speak. After they lost their land, I would think, and so Ardconnell was probably a pretty good farm, if it is the Fergal O'Gara. I don't know.
Anyone else? Any other questions? No?
Where were the manuscripts kept after they were finished?
Where the copies of the scripts now, Louvain and
When the Annals are all in Ireland now.
all of them.
All of them, yes.
Some of them were in Louvain.
There was one volume which was in the Franciscan keep holdings in Merchants Quay first, and then Killiney, and that they were transferred to the Royal Irish to the UCD in the year 2000, and then there's most of them of the other volumes are in the Royal Irish Academy, apart from one volume.
So we have I think is it 3 or 4 altogether?
There's let me see. There were 6 volumes in all. I think it's down to 5 now.
Yeah, but it's the originals.
Yeah.
From that time.
But they didn't come back here, when they were completed, like Fergal was the...
Oh, they did.
They did come back
There was one of them presented to Fergal,
okay,
which is the O'Gara copy it's referred to. Is that correct, Maura? There's a copy called the O'Gara copy that was presented to Fergal himself.
Well,
What was the one we went to see in Trinity back in 2000 and whenever?
That was just the original.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but we do have. I think, if I remember correctly, I thought there was 2 copies.
Yeah, the idea was that there was one set for Louvain, to be sent to Louvain, and the other was to be given to Fergal.
Yeah, but they still exist.
Yeah, I don't think we have any evidence, definite evidence, that it ever reached Fergal.
Yeah.
Though also McIvershey, another Sligo man, when he was writing his book of genealogies, used one of the volumes.
Right.
He went through it very thoroughly,
Okay.
and he refers to it as the book of Fergal O'Gara. So, the history of Fergal O'Gara.
But you would imagine as a patron, probably one of them was presented to him.
Yeah.
Anyone else? No. I again thank Nollaig for persevering with his cough and with his travelling down and everything else on a bad day like that. And I want to thank you all for persevering with us. And I know we ran on a long time, but I think it was well worth it to be able to get the talk that we got today. As I say, if any of you still, presumably all got at this stage, want a copy of this, they are on sale outside in the foyer, so go out and speak to John and he'll be able to sort you out with a copy. Okay, on that, thank you very much. Here, that, what I'm looking at,